First question, how do you check for phase issues?
Yeah, I really wanted to get into some of that in the previous section, but obviously we're pressed for time. So, phase is a really big issue when you're recording drums, and to people that don't really understand, it's whenever you have the same sound source coming in through two different microphones, and those two microphones are at different positions, when you combine those two signals or when they're played back simultaneously, there will be an interaction where it's possible for those sounds to cancel out if it's not hitting both at the same time, or if the way the waveforms, when they're combined, isn't optimal. And with the drums, of course, you've got every kit piece coming through every other piece super loud. So you really have to minimize that. However, to me, it's important to understand that you get phase cancellation really when the source is coming through the same volume in both of those things. While you do get like less and less cancellation as you pull down the volume of something, I'm not going to worry too much about the phase of, let's say, the snare coming through in the spot mics, let's say the spot mic, because that's going to be so quiet in the mix, and the snare is so quiet in that microphone compared with the snare microphone, and they're also going to be panned in different places. The spot mic's going to be over here, the snare mic's going to be over here. That they're not really going to cancel out too much. But where it is really important to nail the phase is things like the snare to the overheads. And I kind of prepped just during lunch just to show you what that really means. People often refer to this thing over here as a phase switch. It's a polarity switch. Phase is something that's continually variable. This just flips the waveform upside down. So it's not a true fix. It's not going to be in phase one way and out of phase the other. It might be. If it was exactly out of phase, then you flip it and it will be exactly in phase. But the reality is everything's probably somewhere in between. But how to check for phase? I've got here one of the overhead mics. It doesn't really matter which one because the snare should be kind of equally loud in both. I've panned it centrally, and I've soloed that along with the snare top mic over here. And what I've done is I've kind of matched the level. So this is what you're hearing. Not quite, actually. Here we go. I want the snare to be kind of peaking and about the same in both the overhead and the snare track. That's where we're really going to hear the interaction of the phase. Now, what I'll do is I will hit this button here, and that will flip the polarity of the snare. And I actually just happen to know that generally whenever I do the 4-foot thing with the overheads that we discussed during tracking, that I always have to flip the polarity of the snare top mic. That's to do with the fact that I normally tune in the same kind of area, and the microphones are generally that same distance away. So we kind of took a punt on that during setup, and it came out true. Because if the first hit you'll hear will have we'll have it in phase, and then I'll click the button, and hopefully you'll hear the difference on the second snare hit. So. Do you hear how the snare basically disappears when I flip the phase switch? That's really how you check, is to see if it disappears when you flip it. But it's very important to check at an even volume. If I now were to take my two overheads, I'm just going to put these all at unity and do my stereo overheads with my snare top mic. And now do this. You can hear a real distinct difference in the body of the snare when it's being hit. I'd say the snare to overheads is probably the single biggest thing to make sure you get right in terms of phase. Same thing goes for toms. Solo off a tom track, listen to it in mono alongside the overhead track. I kind of like to do this after the drummer has played a section. I'll get them to play a beat, record it, then go through and check everything on headphones without the distraction of someone physically playing in the kit, and then make any adjustments on the preamps if you can. Also, just placement is really key, but I get around it by minimizing bleed from one thing to another. As I say, the snare is not super loud in the Spock mic, so I'm not even really going to worry too much about that. And we'll see how we go. Room mics, you can sometimes get a bit of benefit by flipping them around, but just by the distance away from the kit, they interact in a different way. They often are kind of far enough back that it barely matters when you flip the polarity.
Okay, awesome. Is there a point in the mic placement process or even in the recording process where you just have to force yourself to stop and go with what you've got? I feel like the culture of the day is very perfectionistic, but there has to be a point where it just goes too far and you actually just need to get going.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, every session I'm very mindful of time, possibly to a fault sometimes. Like, it's pretty stressful if you're going into a new studio and you have 3 days to do an album or something like that, and you don't know the drummer, you don't know the kit, you don't know the studio, and you want to at least get maybe 2 songs done on day 1 so you can do the rest of the album on the following 2 days. Yeah, you have to at some point just be like, okay, cool, it's good enough. And that's where practicing and really practicing your craft away from the studio, practicing tuning, like I said, I've done that time and time again in my room, on tour, in other studio situations, is key. And again, as we said at the beginning, source tones are everything. Like, if the kit sounded bad, we wouldn't hit record. Kit sounds great, we record. The mic placement is like the icing on the cake. Know where things generally go, use conventional microphones, and you'll probably get a usable result. Don't mess around too much with like compression and EQ on the way in. Just record things flat. You can deal with it in the mix later.
Okay. How important are external amp or preamps when recording drums versus using standard interface desk preamps into your DAW?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm in a minority, but personally I feel like really great preamps are a luxury and not an essential one. From every shootout thing that I've encountered and every studio situation I've been in, I'm not saying there's no difference between preamps, but when you especially run them quite clean, if you're not driving them hard, the differences can be so minimal that it almost makes very little difference most of the time. If you're driving a preamp hard, then sure, a tube preamp or a preamp with really great circuitry, a nice transformer to drive can yield a pleasant sound. But more often, in fact, I've had way more recordings be ruined using great preamps with people pushing them too hard than I've never had a session on a cheap interface where I've been unhappy with the tones. And that includes two sessions come to mind, just working with drummer friends who record drums in very small rooms with just the cheapest gear they could get, just to have enough inputs to record. And by making sure the drums are tuned well and having appropriate microphones, it's always super usable. Like, could be on an album, for sure. And like I say, I've been in top studios recording through banks of Neve preamps to tape, and the sound's been completely ruined because they pushed it too hard. So focus on the source tone, don't worry about the preamps, seriously.
Yeah. Cool. Are you panning the kit drummer's perspective or audience perspective?
Always drummer's perspective.
Okay.
I can't stand audience perspective. It's so weird. To me, like, rock and metal drum tones are so in your face. I'm not a drummer, but to me it still sounds like I'm behind the kit, like I'm sitting in the drum throne. Yeah, like it doesn't feel like I'm looking at a kit over there, which is the only time that makes sense to me. It's like, no, you're inside the kit. The toms are all around here, the snares, like,
right.
Drummer's perspective all the time.
I never understood when we would debate about that in sessions with specifically with different producers.
Yeah.
It never really made sense to me to, and maybe for me because I'm always behind the kit, but trying to envision hearing it the opposite way doesn't...
It screws me up. But if I'm recording a left-handed drum, which I've only done once, I opted to pan that drummer's perspective just so the toms still went from left to right, which I guess I'm just so used to that.
So Travis wants to know, do you normally use the mid-dip switch on the Beta 91?
No, I leave it flat.
You leave it flat all the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you get to mixing, you'll see more of my approach with that, but I sum the mics together and kind of EQ all of them together, and I try not to do too much to them individually. Yeah, we'll get into that later, but
cool.
No mid-cut.
When tracking the drums, you prefer to have your levels more controlled so that you can bring the levels up in the mix, or do you prefer to capture higher and then reduce the gain structure when you go into mixing?
I guess I kind of capture not hot, but not super conservative. Partly because microphones up on really loud sound sources, you could pad and then leave the gain on 0 on the snare preamp, and it would probably still be quite hot. So I generally aim for things to peak no higher than about -6 on like the kick and snare and toms. It's tough. Sometimes things go over that. But if anything, it's always about bringing down levels in the mix for me, always, because you've got 22 microphones summing together. Even if they're all at -12, they're going to sum together to be really loud. So it's always a case of bringing levels down as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. If you place the overhead so that the snare is in the center of the stereo image, what about the kick? Wouldn't that be more off to one side?
Yeah, but I don't really get much kick sound from my overheads at all. Okay. It's negligible in terms of the mix. There isn't that much in there anyway from that position, at least not compared to how loud the kick drum's going to be once the close mics are in. And I'm going to high pass some of that low end out of there anyway. So, in fact, I didn't say anything, but on the microphones, I'm using the low end roll off on the overheads. So it's all just all about the snare and up as far as those are concerned.
Cool.
Are those also high passed on the preamps?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Unless you put that on. no, yeah, they're not high pass.
Cool. One more question, then we'll keep going. Why do metal producers normally use large diaphragms with more low end usually on mics on the overheads if they tend to get heavily filtered anyway?
I don't know, actually. I think a lot of metal producers do that, and then and maybe even we'll see when we get to mixing, maybe I'll end up scooping out a load of it. But there is a difference in the way that a large diaphragm and a small diaphragm condenser present information. I could get really technical as to why, but basically a small diaphragm condenser is going to have a more even response off axis. A large diaphragm condenser is going to have its optimal response directly ahead and have more of a roll off towards the edge. I like that because it keeps the reflections from around the room from being too bright coming back into the microphones. It does, I mean, I don't know. It's much of a muchness, really, in terms of that. Even when you're 4 feet up from the cymbals, and with really great microphones like that, it's not like there's a lack of detail. But a lot of guys, I don't know why they would use a large diaphragm condenser when they're close up on the cymbals and kind of rejecting the shells.
Mm.